talking about how the Native Americans were so friendly to everyone, and then gave him a lot of compliments to President Teddy Roosevelt for getting us back on that track. And so I think that was important for us to show. And I'll turn back to Janelle Burke.
Before I ask my question, I have to make a statement for our viewers that, Scott, you've been very generous over the years in working on behalf of these projects, and that you and others like you certainly have left a wonderful legacy for our community and for our families and for others who are going to be able to use these lands for many years to come. It's very interesting, exciting, and you're to be commended.
You never do it alone.
I'm sure that's true, that there are many people, and so I know that there are some people who want to be out there in the background helping with some of these projects. So my question this time has to do with what we might call non-profits, semi-profits, semi-private lands that are growing up in many places, and not just around lakes, but all over, where people want to preserve some land. Erna asked you earlier about various kinds of land ownership. What are some other possibilities for people who want to preserve land? What are some creative ideas that are coming up now as we go, as our focus shifts into more acquisition of private land?
Well, people can enter into agreements with each other that set forth that the property shall be open to the public or shall remain open. We got two different questions here. One is whether it's open to the public, and the other is whether it's being preserved. And sometimes you really don't want it open to the public. You've got 45 ORVs going over there every day, and a bunch of drunks coming down because they got off where they'd get arrested, and you don't really want all of that in the trash and so forth. You want a Woodstock festival on your property. But that aside, there are methods, and I've seen them and helped actually write a couple of them where they simply said this shall be preserved land, this will remain it. It doesn't involve anybody else other than me and my neighbor or me and my children or this sort of situation. So it can be set aside in a number of different ways. And there are lots and lots and lots of ways to do it. There are a lot of ways to skin the cat.
And would you comment also on the non-profits who might own property on lakes or camps, those kinds of entities?
Yes, and that is unfortunately one of the trends towards losing. We had a campfire camp at Kidd Island Bay, and the campfire camp is now in private ownership. There was a major effort to try to save it, to try to persuade the Spokane campfire people to invest in it, but the fact was that they were losing money on a regular basis. And then we have Camp Easton, the Boy Scouts there, and it's still open to the Boy Scouts and so forth, and that's just fine. That's a situation in which and church camps. Up at Hayden Lake, there's a church camp, and that sort of, and those are open to the public, but rather to limited members of the public. You belong to the organization, but the bars to getting in the organization are not very high. In Boy Scouts, you got to be between this and this age, and the church, you got to belong to the church or be a guest or something like that. But there are lots of those that go on. The problem that they've got is first of all, I have to be tax exempt, because at this time with the high value of lakeshore property, I don't think any nonprofit, if it's really a nonprofit, can afford to own, unless it gets a tax exempt status, which the Boy Scouts do and which churches do, and so forth. So there are those methods of setting aside and having quasi-public ownership, or members of the public can be there.
Erna, it's your turn.
Scott, there's another example of what we're talking about today on today's show that's happening in our region, called the Scotchman's Peak Wilderness, that is north of here between, some of it's in Idaho, most of it's in Montana, but just east of Sandpoint. Very rugged area, and there's a huge contingent of people up there now that are very close, are hoping to create a wilderness area. Can you walk us through the steps that might be involved in getting that designated as a wilderness area, which would make it a public access?
Sure. The first thing you've got to have is a senator or representative from your state who's willing to take this on. We have lots of those in Washington and Oregon, and we have not had many in Idaho. However, at the present time, there are 2 pending propositions in Idaho for creation of wilderness. One of them is called the White Clouds, and Representative Simpson is undertaking that, and that has good prospects for going on. It involves certain concessions, certain designations, and so forth. And one of the problems there are 2 problems you have with wilderness bills. The first is that there are a lot of people who don't want any of it, and the second are that they want it perfect. Absolute nothing else there. Frank Church Wilderness Area, for example, was it's named after him because he was dying, and they decided since he was the major sponsor, it should be. It started off as a Central Idaho Wilderness Area, and it has landing strips in it. It has private in-holdings in it. It was accepted, and that's not unusual that these were accepted and so forth. But the process is one, and what you're talking about there is that a lot of people are doing that. The same thing is true in the upper Priest, on that area between Priest Lake and the state of Washington. That's another area that is a potential wilderness area. Most of the wilderness areas are areas, the reason they're wilderness is that nobody wanted to do anything with them. I mean,
Exactly.
At one point I thought what we ought to do is turn all the Forest Service lands over to private companies because they couldn't afford to log it if they didn't get subsidies, and so it was all wilderness. But that's another one of those bizarre things that doesn't work. But it's a legislative process. It only happens at the federal level. There is nothing in the state of Idaho that allows for this particular situation other than the parkland. The parklands it's a rather interesting story. I told you before in our last discussion that the park department was created under Smiley, and Smiley called a special session of the legislature because the Girl Scouts were coming to Farragut, and he wanted authority to go off and use the National Guard to do this, and then also he wanted to create the park department. But he'd already had a commitment from Harriman, Everett Harriman, the Union Pacific. Harriman said, I want to give you the property down at, what am I thinking of? In South Idaho, the Harriman Park is what it is at the moment. But he said, I want to give that to you. And Smiley said, no, you don't. I have to have a department created first. You make your offer and make it contingent upon creation of the department. So they called it a special session of the legislature, and we got Farragut, and we got that, and that really started the whole thing on.
Great.
But it was a great bargaining proposition.
Excellent.
For our viewers who don't know, Governor Robert Smiley served 3 distinguished terms as governor of Idaho, and Cecil Andrus served 4 terms, one a Republican, Smiley, and the other one a Democrat, Andrus. And they both were involved in these kind of issues, and they had a lot of support from people on both parties. Scott, I want to take a little time. You've been so deeply involved in some wonderful national, international organizations. You've been on the Audubon Society board, and you've been involved with Nature Conservancy. Tell us how these organizations have meant so much to not only people in this country, but even in other parts, especially Nature Conservancy around the world.
I think this is you can't say unique because somebody always comes up and says there are lots of others somewhere else you haven't heard about. But it is a peculiar, particular American creation here. The Audubon Society, the Wilderness Society, Sierra Club, Nature Conservancy, Friends of the Earth, a lot of those sort of things. They were created, Audubon was created more than 100 years ago. Nature Conservancy goes back almost that far. Wilderness Society got created when they passed the Wilderness Bill, or before, in 1966 or thereabouts. And these become advocates. They identify where the property is. They identify their purposes. Audubon has certain property, but it's not really in the land acquisition business. Nature Conservancy is. Nature Conservancy has recently expanded its vision to encompass the world. I was sitting on the Audubon board, not the bottom, the Nature Conservancy Board for Idaho, and we got told, well, China's part of our responsibility, and this seemed a little daunting to undertake that sort of thing. We did hear a little story about China that made you kind of think maybe democracy isn't so good after all. The Nature Conservancy representative in China went to the premier of China and said, you know, it'd be wonderful if you would set aside this property over here for a reserve. And he said, tell me about it, and told him about it, and he said, okay, it's done. That was it.
Tell us more about the Audubon Society, because you served on that one, the national board, and I think you hold the record of serving longer than anyone. What are all the things they do?
Well, obviously, their first and primary concern is birds.
Right.
They have some 500 chapters across the country. A very good one here in Coeur d'Alene, very active, very much involved, and there are 3 or 4 others within this state. Other states have considerably more active chapters. The Seattle one is extremely, Seattle Tacoma Audubon and some of the others. Anyway, these are people who are A, interested in birds, and B, interested in conservation, or interested in one or the other of them. And they have birding trips, and they identify, they do a Christmas bird count, which gives you a strong idea of the status of the whole ecosystem at the time. I mean, are the finches declining, or are the pelicans declining? Do we have an increase? That sort of.
Yeah, I got to tell this story. You have been so wonderful in raising money, and you asked some of us to give money for every. You went down to the Platte River, I believe, in Wyoming, and you said that we should pay certain money for every bird you could count. But you were very generous in what you charged us.
The usual bird count is you count a finch, and then you count a pelican, you do this sort of thing. I just said birds, and since they come in there in terms of something like 5,000 or 10,000 cranes at a time, I never got around to telling people that was really what I was doing.
You didn't bill us for everyone, so that's great. On that note, we have to end our program. Scott Reed, thank you for the last 2 weeks. You're a wonderful, wonderful guest and a great expert on all these subjects, and we thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to be with us again next week, and we'll turn to yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.